towns had a central market. Back in this era before cars, a 5-mile radius was essentially the largest possible commuter zone to small agricultural towns, and therefore having towns 10 miles apart was the most efficient
use of rural land. When you get the chance, take a look at a map of a rural area that existed before cars. You'll see that the distance between medium-sized towns is almost always somewhere between about 10 to 15 miles. Because the Cumberland Valley is a valley, towns really could only develop in a line, but in most cases, towns develop in all directions. This is what the 10-mile rule looks like when going out in all directions. Each of these points is a town, and the hexagon around it is the area from which people will go to the town. In the real world, each of these towns probably has a small grocery store, a pharmacy, a bank, and maybe a restaurant. Since everybody uses these services, there doesn't have to be many people in a town's sphere of influence in order to sustain these shops. But where do you put something more specialized, like a mechanic? People only need to go to the mechanic every once in a while, so you need more people to sustain one mechanic shop than one grocery store. Well, some of these small towns develop into larger towns with more people that can support more specialized shops and services. Putting these larger towns with more specialized shops closer together would be unsustainable, since there wouldn't be enough people going to those shops. But putting them farther apart would be inefficient, since there's land that people would not go to a city from. This happens once or twice more until you have cities. These cities have the largest spheres of influence and the most specialized shops. You of course still have grocery stores and pharmacies in cities, but you also have things like luxury car dealerships, brain surgery centers, and airports. The city's sphere of influence is enormous because people will travel hundreds of miles to buy an expensive car or get brain surgery or fly from an airport. Think about it within a city. How far would you walk to buy a latte? Probably only a few blocks, and that's why you see Starbucks or other coffee shops on almost every block. Since almost everyone buys coffee, you only need a few blocks of people to sustain one coffee shop. But how far would you walk to buy a MacBook? Probably quite far, since it's an infrequent and substantial purchase. That's why Apple stores are rather rare even in cities. You need an enormous amount of people to sustain one Apple store, and we can actually figure out roughly how many. In Connecticut, the Trumbull Apple store is about 20 miles away from the New Haven store to the northeast and the Stamford store to the southwest. In the 10-mile radius around the Trumbull Apple store, there are about 500,000 inhabitants, which tells us that you need about 500,000 people to sustain one Apple store. We can compare that to the Starbuckses of Lower Manhattan, which are spread out at an average distance of about 600 feet. Drawing a 300-foot radius around one Starbucks in Lower Manhattan covers about 6,000 people, which means that one Starbucks needs 6,000 people to sustain it. Of course, both Connecticut and New York are places with higher than average incomes, which means that less people are needed to sustain one Starbucks or Apple store. The numbers would be very different in, say, rural Kansas. But since each store generally only builds in areas with higher than average incomes, this gives a good sense of how many people Apple and Starbucks look for in an area before opening up a store. So our model shows where cities should be, but it's not like this in reality. This is the most efficient spread of cities, if you're assuming that cities are on a perfectly flat plane with no geographic features, no social influences, no variability of income, equal distribution of resources, essentially assuming the world is one homogeneous place, which it's not. In reality, of course, our world has an enormous effect on where and why cities develop. To start out, let's cut this down to one city on a flat, featureless plane for simplicity. What affects the location of cities more than anything is water. If we put an ocean on one side of our isotropic plane, our city will almost certainly locate near it. Oceans have always been and still are what connects the world. There's no other means of transport that can move such enormous amounts of cargo for so little. Any city needs to be economically efficient to grow, and it will cost more to bring goods to a city that's 1,000 miles inland than one right by the ocean. Just look at Europe. 6 of the 10 largest European cities are within 100 miles of the coast. But oceans aren't the only bodies of water to affect cities. Rivers are just as, or perhaps even more influential. Milan, the 19th largest European city, is the largest to not be either directly on the ocean or on a river, and even then, it's only 15 miles from a river and 75 miles from the ocean. Until the last century or so, cities could not survive without